Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about service level agreements and why they are important. First, let's define a service level agreement. It is a legally binding document, an agreement between a cloud service provider and a cloud service consumer. The cloud service provider, often referred to as a cloud vendor, is simply a company that makes services available, cloud services available to customers for a fee. Cloud service consumer, on the other hand, is a company, an enterprise that purchases or leases service from the provider. For example, Infor, which is the developer of CSI, which is a software as a service cloud-based platform. They purchase from Amazon Web Services their infrastructure as a service. So you have a combination of software as a service provided by Infor running on the IaaS infrastructure provided by Amazon. So you can have a combination of one or more cloud models in your enterprise. Then we have platform as a service, a platform such as a .NET platform for application development, application deployment, customization. Middleware is the term that comes to mind when you're talking about platform as a service. The SLA, the service level agreement, is important, critical actually, if you are a company and you are going to rely upon a third-party vendor, a cloud vendor or a cloud service provider to provide your infrastructure, for example, then there needs to be a very clear definition of the level of service that will be expected. The agreement should include the quality that's expected, the availability, what is the uptime, and what are the responsibilities of the vendor versus the responsibilities of the company that's purchasing or leasing the services from the vendor. The first thing, usually it will start with an RFP and a request for proposal where you will get multiple quotes. Companies will get multiple quotes from prospective cloud vendors, and in those RFPs they will define what they can provide, and the cloud service consumer or the company that's going to be purchasing or leasing the cloud service must be specific in their definition of the characteristics of their business. For example, is this an individual that's going to be using the service, or is it an enterprise customer? If it's an individual, then you could think of something like iCloud is a very common cloud service that's provided through Apple. Enterprise customers like Infor. Is it a paying versus a non-paying customer? The book talks about freemium, free services that are offered to consumers, to individuals usually who are not necessarily paying for the service. Gmail is a good example of that. Then is it regulated or is it non-regulated? For example, is it a healthcare industry? Is it banking, insurance, government, retail? Those are all very highly regulated, and so the service level agreement must take into consideration all of the regulations of the industry, because the security issues are going to be critical if you're talking about a regulated industry. Does the vendor expect to store personally identifiable information, or is it going to be anonymous? Those are all very important considerations when considering which vendor you're going to select as your representative, basically the keeper of your keys to your enterprise. So the security concerns are paramount. It's a question of whether the data that's being tracked and stored and managed is critical or non-critical. Will the cloud service provider have to maintain personally identifiable information, biometric data such as fingerprints, DNA, voice recognition software comes to mind, retina scans? All that information is stored in a database somewhere. And so that biometric data, although unique to an individual, must be protected by the cloud service provider as well as the company who stores that, who is the owner of that information. Social security numbers, of course, very critical. Credit card numbers as well. Any financial information and banking information, online banking industries must be extremely secure. Then you have non-critical data like photo sharing. There are several photo sharing apps. Google has one. The social media apps like Facebook and YouTube and Snapchat and Instagram and Twitter. There are quite a few social media applications, video streaming applications like YouTube. They are not as critical, with the exception of the fact that if there's personal information that is stored with the non-critical data, that has to be protected as well. So security has to be outlined specifically in a service level agreement. There's different types of components that will be included in a service level agreement, such as, is it going to provide transaction processing? Is it going to be, for example, if you're an e-commerce organization, if you are a Walmart or an Amazon, are you selling to customers, retail customers, and do you need point of sale transactions? If you go to a grocery store and your information is, or your purchases are scanned using the barcode and they're scanned and the prices come up and the method of payment comes up, all of that has to be almost instantaneous because consumers are creatures of habit. We are expecting immediate gratification. We do not want to wait for the system to process a transaction. If it happens too often, the lines in the store will get long. Eventually, customers will be lost and revenue because the transactions took too long to process. Then, if you're a business to consumer, if it's a business to consumer type component, if you go to, for example, an Amazon to purchase something, or you go to any online store, and that website takes a long time to process, takes a long time to come up. The response time is slow. The availability is not strong. The reliability, sometimes it's up, sometimes it's not. You're going to lose customers that way. And so there has to be a very specific level of expectation with regards to response time. Now, with business to business transactions, it's not so much the response time, but it's more the security. You don't want people getting a hold of the procurement cards or credit card information for a university, for example, that makes purchases from a vendor. So the security has to be in place. And then there's, of course, the middleware. As I mentioned before, there are some companies that do nothing but write middleware, which can then be sold to another company for purposes of integrating two disparate systems together. All of those types of service level agreement components have to be specifically outlined, and each one have their own unique set of characteristics. How can you measure whether the service level agreement is effective or not. So you can look at the amount of uptime. Usually there will be some kind of a requirement in the service level agreement for 99.99% uptime. In other words, no downtime, which means that there better be some redundancy in place in case there's a hardware failure, there's multiple hardwares, there's RAID and fault tolerant services that can be used to make sure that the hardware does not become a bottleneck. You have web farms and server farms and all kinds of ways that you can maintain uptime of an application or a service. How long does it take for the page to load? Again, if you're a consumer, you go to a B2C consumer, you go to a website, it takes a long time for that page to load. More than likely, you're going to go on to the next website. That's the nature of today's consumer. How long does it take to process a transaction? It should be almost instantaneous. The application programming interface, again, that's the middleware. What is the response time? Is the middleware a bottleneck? You cannot introduce additional bottlenecks by having an API that takes longer than it should. How long, if you report an incident, how long does it take for somebody to respond to you? A trouble ticket, for example. How long does it take before you get notified? And how long does it take to get the incident resolved? How long does it take to generate a report? All of those things are ways that the service can be measured. There are companies that do nothing but measure the effectiveness of a third-party vendor and provide their metrics to the company so that they can assess if the service level agreements are being met or not, simply put. All right, so here's the bottom line. Service level agreements are a pledge that certain performance metrics will be met, uptime, availability, those kinds of response time. The security and the privacy has to be in place. If you are handing over the keys to your company to a third party, there must be very specific service level agreements in place. Next week, we're going to talk about network security. There are several examples of internal, either intentional or inadvertent errors that have led to major security breaches in the last few years. We will talk about some of them. So the personnel that are working for that cloud service provider, the cloud vendor, the personnel have to be held accountable, and the company has to hire reliable administrators and reliable employees that will not breach the security of the company with which they are doing business. That gets to be a little complicated because it's difficult to guarantee that the employees in a third-party vendor won't go rogue on you. And that's very hard for the company, the enterprise, to control. It's even hard for the employer to control, less long the enterprise. So that becomes a whole another layer of complexity in a service level agreement. Bonding may have to happen so that there's a financial responsibility associated with a security breach. If the provider is providing for a regulated industry, again, like healthcare, banking, retail, government, if that is the nature of the industry, then the cloud service provider must be certified to meet those regulations. The more mission critical the service, the more specific the service level agreement must be. Cloud service provider will be legally required to deliver the services that have been outlined in the agreement, hence the nature of the agreement. The enterprise companies need to be protected. Even if they are relying upon a cloud vendor, they still need to be able to have some sort of legal recourse if things go wrong and if there is a security breach. Cloud services that target enterprise customers will typically have very strict service level agreement requirements, as opposed to the cloud services like iCloud, which provides for individual consumers. Usually in that case, the service level agreement will protect the provider more than the consumer. I have, for this week's assignment, I have included a sample service level agreement template that you can look at. It will give you a feel for the information, the type of information that should be included in a service level agreement. This is just a template. It's not specific, but it will definitely give you an overview of what a service level agreement should look like. Let me know if you have any questions.